It's a pleasure to be here. So I don't know how many of you have actually ever been to the Knott Dairy Center. It's out there on its own a little bit, right? But that's a beautiful picture of as you first enter the Knott Dairy Center, you see, the building, the gardens, the flowers. It's it could be a very beautiful setting out there on the Palouse. So, but on the next slide, I'm gonna go ahead. I have a couple slides, and then I'm gonna hand it off to Marcos. But I just wanted to highlight some of well, I'm a little biased, but some of the cool research that we do. So a lot of my appointment is actually working directly with dairy farmers. And so some of these projects might seem like they're a bit out there, like pest bird management, but the pest bird project was actually producer driven. So I didn't even know there was a pest bird problem until some dairy farmers told me that there was a pest bird problem. And so I said, well, let's look into it. We conducted a survey across Washington state. And that's when we realized it was actually a $14.7 million per year problem for the Washington dairy industry. So that was really eye-opening, I think, to everyone. I think a lot of farmers didn't realize that a lot of their co-farmers also were having pest bird problems. And so once we had that number in hand, we solicited some funding for research and extension work, and then looked at trying to figure out, okay, the estimates that we currently had for pest bird damage on farms were self-reported by farmers, and so they were purely just estimates. We were trying to look at how could we get those numbers even more precise, right? So what are these birds doing on dairies? And so you might actually be wondering, right, what are they doing on dairies? To give you a little taste, they are eating at least about 4% of feed that's put out for cattle. And so if you think about a dairy cow, right, over 1,000 pounds of a cow, right, she has this feed delivered in front of her. And in theory, every bite of food she takes should be a well-balanced diet. That's how we deliver it. That's how we intend those cows to get the nutrition they need to produce that wonderful milk for us. So the birds are very smart, actually, and they'll come through when the fresh feed's delivered. They'll go and pick out only the food they want, the high energy. Usually it's the really high energy feed, which is also the most expensive. So they'll go through, pick out what they want, and then when the cows come back from milking, whatever's left for the cows in the feed is what they get. So we're talking about affecting not only the economics on the farm, but also dairy cow welfare and well-being. So we've looked at different ways to deter birds. We've tried all sorts of fun things. If you go out to the Knott Dairy Center, you'll see kestrel nest boxes. And that top picture there is a American kestrel. The American kestrel population in this area is decreasing due to loss of habitat, especially for nesting. And so we actually put up nest boxes out at the Knott Dairy Center to attract these birds to the dairy, provide them a nice nest site, and then in turn, they scare off our pest birds. So when I talk about pest birds, an example would be like the European starling. Europeans love them. In the United States, we don't really care for them too much. But anyways, we've also tried lasers. So one of the other techniques we tried is putting these lasers up in the cow barns, the freestall barns, and they shoot from one end to the other end. And there's the red lights and the green lights, and they have different patterns so that it's unpredictable. And so that's a little bit of bird behavior and cow behavior research on how to keep these birds off farms. So that's our pest bird project. And then the next slide, another area that's completely different is, so Marcos, can I get the next slide? Sorry. The next one is, this is completely a different topic, but this is focused on, employee safety or human safety. And I've actually developed some partnerships with the Panache Center, if anyone's familiar with that, over at UW. And we work together. They bring kind of that human occupational health and safety aspect. I bring the animal behavior and adult education extension work aspect to it. And this is one of my favorite pictures. It was the very first LEADS training that we provided. And the LEADS training is Leaders Enabling Advanced Dairy Safety. And these are all managers or some type of leader on different farms. We offered several more of these, but ultimately we were able to identify how people were getting injured on farms from their interactions with cattle. And once we identified the top 4 types of injuries that occurred, we then tried to figure out how those injuries might happen and how to prevent them. And that's what this training is all about. But it's also a train-the-trainer model. So once these leaders were trained, they were given all of the materials they needed to go back to their farm and deliver the training on their farm. So this has been a very impactful project and a really good partnership we have with UW. And I also want to mention that a lot of the research and work we do with UW on this project, they couldn't do without us and the Knott Dairy Center, because obviously they don't have a dairy center to be able to do the research part. So on the next slide, the last area I want to talk about is early detection of disease, right? So obviously we're always trying to provide the best quality of life, a healthy life for our animals. And if we can use technology to actually help us identify disease sooner, we can treat those animals sooner and hopefully have a better prognosis for them. So it's better for the animal and it's better for the farmer as well. In this case, we've been trying to use some different technologies like infrared thermography. And one study we conducted recently was actually trying to use infrared thermography to detect digital dermatitis, right? So that's like a foot or hoof issue that cattle get. So this is kind of a cool picture to show where you can see the variations in temperatures in the foot. Some other technologies we try to use are activity monitoring devices. So in the next slide, and this will be my final slide, I want to show you this cool technology that we have at the Knott Dairy Center called Cow Manager. And so Cow Manager, we were able to actually put this on every single cow at our dairy because of a donation that we received from a company to do research with them. So I think that's another really great, thing to highlight is sometimes these partnerships work out really well where, we're able to gain something that benefits, the dairy or a unit as the whole. So Cow Manager is so neat. Animal behavior is my specialty, right? And a lot of times we end up either taking direct observations to look at behavior, or we have to put up video cameras and somebody has to watch all that video footage, right? So the activity monitoring devices like Cow Manager are just a delight for someone like me, right? Because every single day I get an Excel file from Cow Manager that tells me what every cow at the Knott Dairy Center did every hour of that day, which is just phenomenal, right? If you think about the behavior research opportunities there, it's a great tool. Besides the research part though, it's very helpful for both our CUDS group, our dairy students, because they use it to help monitor their cows. And it's very helpful for our dairy manager as well, because she uses this tool to monitor cow health as well. So anyways, I wanted to show you, this is what Cow Manager looks like. This is the kind of behaviors that it gives us. And it's just a great tool. But I didn't want to spend a lot of time. I just wanted to give you a flavor of the types of research and things we're doing and how we use the Knott Dairy Center to essentially meet those needs of the dairy industry. A lot of the work that I do and that Marcos does is very centric on how do we help the dairy farmers and in some cases the dairy employees as well. So, but now I'm going to turn it over to Marcos so he can enlighten you with all of his ideas on nutrition.
So I'm gonna focus on the 2 trials that I'll start this fall. I have some other ongoing projects, but I want to focus on more recent and how we can impact the dairy industry with that. There's one project regarding methane reductions in cows. We all know this is a hot topic right now, and also mammary gland development in their heifers. So how can nutrition impact mammary gland development? I've been having problem. There you go. So the first idea is feeding seaweed to lactating cows. There's been a lot of research focused on seaweed, but none of them is a long-term trial. So we want to see the long-term impact of feeding seaweed to lactating cows. So most of the seaweeds available to feed cows They have bromoform flavonoids or polyphenols, and those will inhibit the growth of methanogenic bacteria, the archaea, and they are very effective. Although there are some evidence that they can impact negatively the dry matter intake and the production, or that the cow or the cow rumen, the microbiome in the rumen can adapt to those, and actually you end up losing that effect over time. For that reason, so that's just a very small idea here for several different seaweed they've been using. It varies from 2% to 67% methane reductions in those animals. We will use this one that the promise is about 35% reductions in methane. However, there are some indications that it can negatively impact dry matter and performance. So we're gonna run this. That's the first trial in the US, or actually in the world, with a long-term trial. And our idea is to feed the Asparagopsis taxiformis, reduce methane without impacting health and performance of those animals. So we're gonna have like different levels. We're gonna use 28 Holstein cows. We do have Calangates at our farm, so we can feed them individually. We can measure intake individually, performance individually. We're gonna take blood samples, milk samples, and all the data we need. But in the end, I think the most important thing is we're gonna measure methane, and this can have a huge impact. We all know that Washington State is now working to more or less mirror whatever California is doing to implement any kind of digester of methane reduction in dairy farms. Seaweed is not approved in Washington State yet. It is in California. So we think this study can actually help the Washington State determine like the levels to use and how they will implement the use of seaweed with dairy cows. And that can actually impact not only Washington State, but the US overall. So the second idea that is also very much linked to the dairy industry, that's most of the farmers are trying to what we call shrink the heifer phase, because the last heifers, so heifers are young cows, so cows that did not calve yet. So young heifers, they're trying to reduce as much as possible the number of heifers they have at the farm because they are expensive. We don't use all the heifers you produce to replace the cow herd. So they're trying right now to raise only the heifers you need to replace the cow herd. So one strategy is to use beef on dairy, is basically using sexed semen in young heifers and inseminating cows with beef semen, and all those offspring from those dairy beef crossbred are going to the beef industry. And we're going to use all those cows or those heifers inseminated with sexed semen to replace the cow herd. However, this is still not enough. A second strategy they're using to reduce the cow herd. So on average, guys, so you know, a heifer will calve with about 24 months. They will have their first calving with about 24 months. What the farmers are doing right now is inseminate them about 3 to 4 months earlier, about 11 to 12 months. So they will have their first calving with about 20 to 21 months. So they cut off about 3 to 4 months of their lifespan. So they reduce feed cost, labor, facility usage, and all those kind of things if they use. However, we do know that those heifers here, regardless of their body weights, will have compromise their mammary gland development. So with that, our idea is to find a strategy to overcome this problem in the mammary gland development. In the end, what happens is that heifer is calving too early, and that heifer will not have their mammary gland fully developed. So we came up with what we call a proof of concept idea, that what happens with that heifer is that she starts cycling with about 7 to 8 months. And on a regular dairy, you would inseminate that heifer with 15 months. So that means that heifer will have about 9 to 10 estrus cycle. And on each estrus cycle, you can see here that there's a peak in prolactin and a peak in estradiol, and those are strong stimulants of mammary gland growth. So if we inseminate those heifers earlier, they will have less events of estrus cycles. That means that they will have less mammary gland development. So what we're trying to do here is that we're going to use, again, this is a proof of concept idea. We're going to inject growth hormone on those heifers when they are very young, non-lactating animals. You can see here that there's a window of opportunity in growth hormone because during the estrous cycles, the growth hormone does not increase. And we do know that growth hormone is also a stimulant of mammary gland development. So our hypothesis is that with less estrous cycle, that heifer is not the mammary gland is not fully developed. But if we use external hormone to stimulate the mammary gland growth, we may overcome that problem in mammary gland development. That's a very conceptual model. Again, we're not at this point, we're not saying that we will suggest farmers doing that. We now need to prove that we can overcome that problem. And if that is possible, we will find some other strategies or we even BST. Remember, this is a proof of concept in non-lactating animals. So some study that I did previously, still under review. This is a heifer. Those are two heifers, very, very young. This is a heifer where we did inject it, the growth hormone, that we did not inject it, the growth hormone, exactly the same age and body weight. You can clearly see the difference in mammary gland development. So when you inject the growth hormone, there's a huge growth in mammary gland development on those animals. So that's the idea. And if we can do that, I think we have a lot of follow-up studies with that. So the idea is to have only 3 treatments: a positive control, where the animals will be bred at 14 months, a negative control, animals will be bred at 11 months. We want all heifers calving at the same body weight, so the nutrition plan of this is a little higher. Those animals will gain a little more weight. And the RBST injection, where the animals will have the same gain, but with the RBST injection. So again, all heifers calving at the same body weight, but not at the same age. We want to isolate. And then we do mammary gland assessment, biopsies, physical assessment, and then milk yield and composition, the first lactation. That's the second study. I just wanted to point out that we do have what we call a Rositec system. Is a continuous flow system. What you see here are fermenters or jars where we put rumen fluid, and we can test here several diets. We can test, like, do forage evaluation, additives assessment and screening. We can test new molecules. We have an idea to test 3-NOP here, which is also another molecule that's being used to reduce methane production on those animals. We can do gas production analysis, so we can see the impact of all those on methane production. We can do a little bit of modeling and prediction, and also reduce animal trials, especially with cannulated animals when we do this in vitro assessment. So we do have this available in our lab. I already ran like 3 or 4 trials on it. It is also a very good trial. So I'll try to stick with the time here. So with that, I would like to thank you. Thank you for the opportunity, and we're glad take any questions you guys might have.
Marcos, I don't know if you saw that there was a question in the chat.
I did not. Let me see.
And now there's a second one that just popped up.
Yeah, it is Blue Ocean Barns. Actually, who is funding is Nestle. I think Nestle is paying for it, and it's a grant for about $650,000. That's the full amount of the grant. I don't know how much is coming from Blue Ocean Barn and how much is coming from Nestle. That's the full amount of the grant. Okay, and second question, are you testing your modeling on drought-resistant cow? Jacob, what do you mean by drought-resistant cows?
So cattle that are more less susceptible to drought, just as water resources are dwindling across the U.S. Are you guys looking at making cows a little bit more resilient to drastic
drought? Yeah, there's something that we cannot do that because, like, milk is very much linked to water intake. There are some studies with beef animals, Jacob, trying to see the relevance of like trying to limit water intake and see if that will impact performance. But almost 100% of the cases, you do limit performance when you limit water intake. So I haven't seen any studies with good or with animals that will drink less water and have the same performance as other animals. Water is related not only to production but also to health. Whenever you limit water intake, you have a real drop in health. So far, I'm sorry, but I cannot say that there are many research out there. So there's another question. This is a sentence for most, but feeding, sprinkling of brominated dairy to only dairy cows in the states of less than will have a same annual climate. That's very exciting, Alex. However, we need to be very careful with seaweed, especially because of the long-term adaptation that there's some evidence that the rumen will adapt to that, and that's why we need so much this long-term trial, because they take the numbers they get based on a study with like, I think it was 45 or 60 days, and we're expanding that. A cow will produce milk around 300 days per year. So you're expanding 60 to 300 days, and we already have some evidence that the rumen will adapt, and that 35% reduction in methane will drop to maybe 10 to 15%. Mm-hmm. Still, you need to remember that ruminants respond to about, if I'm not mistaken, I had that number yesterday, but about 15% of all the methane in the world, and dairy cows is the great majority of it. So if you can reduce 15% or 20% of methane, it is a lot. So that's a huge impact on the world climate if we can do that via nutrition.
Chris, you have a question?
Yeah, thanks, Kim. Amber and Marcos, really great talks. Thank you very much. Just a question on infrastructure. I know the whole dairy could stand to be replaced, obviously, or upgraded or whatnot, but are there particular pieces of infrastructure that really stand out as something that you need done to help be able to expand the research enterprise and production? I'm wondering what your top one or two needs are. Thank you.
Right. Well, I gotta tell you right off the bat, internet is one of our big challenges. The access of good, stable, consistent internet is a huge need, and that's both an effect on, all three, research, teaching, and extension, right? So from an extension standpoint, I would love to have the capability, especially when we get our facilities, that 10 million from the state funds. Once we get our facilities, improved a little bit, I would love to have, extension online meetings out there, right? But right now we just don't have the capabilities to do that. And from a research standpoint, if you think about all those technologies we'd love to incorporate, like Cow Manager, Marcos has technologies he would love to incorporate. That all takes, a lot of power there, and we just don't have that internet capacity right now. So sorry to jump in, Marcos, but that's one right off the top of my head that I was like, we have to have good internet access.
Yeah, that's by far the most important thing we need to improve at the farm. We also need a good handling area. So especially like for cows, despite the facilities are old, we can run trials at the farm. Maybe some piece of equipment will help us a lot, but we need a handling area. We don't have a place to weight the animals. If we need to do some, for instance, mammary gland assessment, either biopsies or ultrasound or anything, we don't have a place or a chute or a place to restrain the animals. Or if you have want to move a group of animals, 28 animals, to a holding pen. So we really need a handling area, as we have in the beef center, for instance, and that shouldn't be hugely expensive. For my heifer study, we are building a adapt pen to house the animals during this trial, but there are many issues with that, and the amount of money for that is much higher. We need to build new facilities, and so thing that we can do in the short term, I guess, like internet by far is the most important thing. And a handling area is super important when doing with research. Other than that, also remove those cables. We use like electrified cables to separate the animals into pens. That's too dangerous. We need to remove that. We need like a better flow in the farm. Those are like small things that we don't need like huge amount of money to implement. That would be very good if we can do that. Anything else that from the top of your mind, Amber?
No, you've covered it really well. I do need to give a shout out real quick. I don't want to make anyone blush, but I noticed who's on today's meeting. And when I talk about Com Manager and the data, Dan and Jessica, I don't know if they remember this from years ago, but when I was a pretty new assistant professor and was trying to get my hands on this data from Com Manager, they were crucial in helping me work with that company from the Netherlands to get that data. So Dan, Jessica, this is a shout out to you that it's working. I'm getting the data and we're publishing and getting grants using that data. So it was worth your time.
Now we need internet.
Yeah, yeah, we do.
Right. All right.
And I'm just one more time popping that video in the chat. If you want to see the cows, you want to see the tags and examples, and you don't have time to go out there, watch the 2-minute video. You can see the cows and the cow manager, and it's pretty exciting. This is great. I mean, I've been at WSU 18 years and had never been to the Not Dairy until 4 months ago when you all took Chris and I out there. So it was an eye-opener for me, and you're doing just fantastic research. So thank you for sharing that today.
Thank you so much for having us. Also, I just want to put out there, Marcos and I give really good tours. So if anybody wants to come out for a tour, hit us up, send us an email. We'd love to take you out there.